Welcome to this episode of Evidence of Greatness. And for this episode, I'm going to talk about a recent article that I published with my really good friends, Cecil and Paula Lange. And this article is entitled Solution-Focused Brief Therapy Presuppositions, a comparison of 1.0 and 2.0 SFBT approaches. And one of the things that I want to say about this is that this research is just in the beginning stages in as far as the comparison goes between 1.0 and 2.0. Is it there or not? But this is the first study that really kind of looks at that assertion that the SFBT approach has been evolving and that we're doing something different now than we were at the beginning. And the other thing I want to say about this research is that this research is a microanalysis study, and it took several years actually to do and to carry out. And so again, we tried to be as meticulous as possible, but I really want to point out that this is comparing these approaches on one factor, their use of presuppositions, and not the totality of them. So I think that's important to point out as we get started. So that obviously begs the question, what are presuppositions? Presuppositional questions linguistically suppose or assume something in advance. It presupposes, assumes, or supposes a thing, a condition, or a state in order to elicit new information from the client. Now, this definition is a definition that we came up with as part of this study as we were starting to try to identify, like, where can we linguistically identify presuppositions? So this definition kind of gave us clues or ideas about where to identify those presuppositions linguistically. So as we went, microanalysis, one of the things that I should point out here is that microanalysis is an inductive process. So you don't really go into it with a research question that might be common in other types of research of do 1.0 therapists use more or less presuppositions than others, or 2.0, are there specific things about presuppositions that we want to know? And instead, what you do is you kind of watch the video, watch the sessions that happen, and then you kind of watch what stands out to you. So as we went through that inductive process, we just started looking at identifying presuppositions, and then we started saying, well, what did these presuppositions have in common? What are some of the differences about these presuppositions? And as we went through that inductive process, we came up with 4 different types of presuppositions. And you see 3 of those types here, and the 4th will be on the next slide. The first kind of presupposition that we started to recognize and notice was this directing presuppositions. Directing presuppositions advance the conversation, but they do so in a way when no client language or no deictic references have been identified in the previous utterance. And what we mean by that is the client would say something and the therapist follows with a presupposition, but the presupposition doesn't contain any of the client's language, or it doesn't capture a deictic reference, is something like this or that. So an abbreviation of what the client said. If the client says, I've been going through a lot, instead of repeating directly, I'm going through a lot, the therapist might say something like, man, it seems like that's a lot. And that would be all the things that you're going through capsulated in the word that. The word that is therefore the deictic reference. So a directing presupposition doesn't include a deictic reference, nor does it include any of the client's language, but it moves the conversation along in a way, in essence, that the therapist has determined that the conversation needs to be directed. I'm going to skip over the next one and discuss redirecting first, just because I think that might help. A redirecting presupposition advances the conversation by offering the juxtaposition of the client's language, in essence, providing the opposite or an alternative version of the client's language. So oftentimes when we say something like, what are your best hopes? The client would say, I just don't want to feel like this anymore. Then the redirecting takes that, I don't want to feel like this, and kind of flips it over on its head. And it says, and if you weren't feeling like this, what would you like to feel instead? And that instead kind of says, instead of asking you more about what you don't want to feel, I'm going to redirect the conversation to something consistent with what you do want to feel. So sometimes those presuppositions redirect the conversation, and typically it's just the inverse of what the client has just said. And then the third type of presupposition is a continuous presupposition. And this advances the conversation by utilizing some of the client's exact language from a previous utterance or utterances, or a deictic reference also referring to the client's language. So this is where they pick up some of the language and include it in the presupposition, but also move that conversation forward by assuming something that hasn't been made overtly relevant up to that point. So an example of that is somebody might say, if we're talking about, suppose tomorrow a miracle happens and you wake up and you have the kind of courage that you're looking for. What would be the first thing that you notice? And maybe the client says something like, I would notice that I'm smiling, right? A continuous presupposition that could potentially follow that is, and what difference would waking up with a smile on your face make to you on that morning? So they picked up the word waking up and smile in that, but they also presupposed that waking up with a smile is going to make a difference. So that continues the conversation, it moves it forward, adds another detail, it utilizes the client's language, but it also asks the client to supply additional information that wasn't included in their previous answer. So hopefully that helps kind of understand some of what we mean about these presuppositions. And so we started actually doing our analysis and we identified these three types. But then as we kept going, one of the things we noticed is that there was something else happening that we hadn't really captured with these three different types of presuppositions. And that's when we added a fourth type of presupposition, and that's this conditional presupposition. And this is a question that's predicated upon a specific hypothetical situation that the client is asked to consider. If something is hypothetical, and we just added this as part of the definition in order to clarify, something's hypothetical if it's based on possible, imagined, or suggested ideas or situations rather than actual ideas. So sometimes the client will jump into the past, and they'll say, well, I used to have da da da. That's an actual event that happened. So we're not making presuppositions about actual events. But the miracle question is a really great example of this. Now I want you to answer this question. Suppose a miracle has happened. That's the conditional hypothetical situation. A miracle has happened. The answer to the question would therefore be contingent or conditional upon a miracle having happened. So one of the things that we realized is that oftentimes a solution-focused therapist will say, suppose this condition is present, what would your answer be then? So that presupposition of the hypothetical situation is one piece of a presupposition, but oftentimes there's a second presupposition that's added of, given this situation being present, what would you notice, or what would be different, and so it kind of layers presuppositions, but we kind of capsulated that into conditional presuppositions. So all of that happened as we went through and looked at various sessions to say, what kinds of presuppositions exist within these sessions. Then, in order to compare 1.0 and 2.0, we went back to Mark McCurgo's paper, where he posited theoretically that there were differences between where solution-focused brief therapy began and where solution focused brief therapy is today. And he said, in essence, I believe 2.0 or a difference in evolution has occurred, and there's something fundamentally different that's happening. So we looked at three different some of his theoretical tenets, and those tenets are listed here, these three. He mentioned that there would be a significant difference in how the two versions of SFBT use language, including the purposes behind their representative uses of language. He also mentioned that the earlier form of SFBT is often more action-oriented in its linguistic content, and as a means of developing a behavioral intervention to find an answer to solve problems, whereas 2.0 is more description-oriented. So in 1.0, they might use words like doing, what would you do, or what would need to happen, and those words, those action-oriented words, are consistent with setting goals, achieving goals, and that goal orientation kind of being a foundation of 1.0. Whereas 2.0 makes a really clear assertion that they say, we're not trying to achieve anything, we're just trying to describe the presence of the client's desired outcome. So that we wanted to see, is 2.0 actually less or more action-oriented than 1.0? And then that third point is, in solely expanding the details on 2.0, it contains more linguistic content about the relationships that are closest to the client. So we wanted to look and see, like, really, are there differences in the amounts of relationships that are talked about, or what is different about the way that relationships are discussed differently between these versions? So that's kind of the premise of how we tried to look at this information. So then we used Elon software, and this is just a free software that's available online. And what you do is you upload videos into this software, and it allows you to really slow it down so you can watch at a reduced rate, so you can really pull apart the language. You can highlight certain sections of the transcript, and it'll just play that portion of the transcript again and again. That way, then you can really make sure that you're analyzing it correctly. So we used Elon as an analysis tool. Then, comparing 1.0 to 2.0 therapists, we chose 3 of each: Insoo Kim Berg, Steve DeShazer, and Yvonne Dolan as 1.0 therapists, as obviously the founders and the experts in this approach in its early days; Elliot, Connie, Evan, George, and Chris Iveson as 2.0 therapists. And predominantly this was because Mark McCurgo in his paper, which asserts this 1.0 versus 2.0 difference, talks about brief, which Evan and Chris are both a part of brief, as examples of 2.0 therapists. And Elliot really learned how to do this approach from working with Chris and Evan. You can see here also a synopsis of the sessions that we analyzed. Those numbers in parentheses, that's how long the sessions were. So you can see each of those sessions ranged, shortest being Insoo's at 48 minutes, longest being Evan's at 1 hour and 1 minute, but all within about 12 or 13 minutes of each other. So they're pretty comparable. Many of these clients were middle-aged clients, with the exception of Insoo's, who was an adolescent, and Yvonne's, who was a younger woman, probably in her 20s. And you can look then at kind of what brought them to therapy to begin with as well. So these are the sessions that we looked at, and we analyzed the full sessions, all 6 of those sessions. So then, what are the results? What did we find? This huge table takes a few important details. One of the things that's really important is the total number of utterances. So you see here that 1.0 therapists use only about half as many utterances as 2.0 therapists. Now, this could be for a couple of reasons. Maybe the clients talked a lot more. Maybe the therapists asked shorter questions, which I think is actually the case. 2.0 therapists tend to ask very short questions. With the exception of Evan, you can kind of see he's a little bit less than the other 2. He tends to ask a bit wordier questions. So that tells you how many utterances. And again, these sessions were pretty equivalent in the length. So it's that 1.0 therapists are actually speaking less often than 2.0 therapists. So of those utterances, how many of them contained presuppositions? You can see here only about, if we round, about 20% of 1.0 utterances contained presuppositions, whereas about 50% of 2.0 utterances contained presuppositions. And again, Evan was a bit of an outlier here. But you look at those numbers 20% of the time versus 50% of the time. So overall, 2.0 therapists are using presuppositions more often. And then this third column really is just the opposite of this. How many of those are not presuppositions? 80% versus 50%-ish. Then these next three columns tell you the differences in percentages of directing, redirecting, and continuous presuppositions. What's really, really interesting and fascinating here is that despite the different amounts of presuppositions they use, the types of presuppositions tend to be pretty similar. Both use about 10% directing presuppositions. Both use minimal redirecting presuppositions. And by far, 85 to 87% of the time, they're using conditional presuppositions. So it doesn't even really matter how many presuppositions they're using, but when they use them, they're using similar kinds. So in some sense, I think this is really important because this is telling us there is continuity, there is similarity. These clinicians are doing some things really similar to each other. And when you think about it, what we're looking at here is almost 900 presuppositions. 900 utterances. And so to be really equivalent with 85 to 87% continuous presuppositions, that's a really important thing, because what it does is it means that very consistently they're using client language. Very consistently, when they presuppose something, they're taking that from what the client has said. Now, when we get to conditional presuppositions here, that's really, really important, because what that means is there's a huge difference. 17 of the 70, or 25% of the time, are 1.0 presuppositions conditional, whereas over 80% of 2.0 presuppositions are conditional. What that means is, again, it goes back to what Mark was talking about around description. And most of what 2.0 therapists are doing are describing the presence of the desired outcome. So that means they have to presuppose the presence of that desired outcome over and over and over. Whereas 1.0 therapists are trying to orient to what's the task that I can give, what's the homework assignment that I can give, what's the solution to the problem that brought them here, how do we recognize goal attainment, right? That requires much less presupposing. So there's a huge difference here in sheer number, 17 versus 230, but also in percentages, 1/4 of the time versus 3/4 of the time. So there is something markedly different in the way that 1.0 and 2.0 therapists are presupposing. 2.0 therapists, by and large, are presupposing the presence of some hypothetical situation. And I would say that most often is the presence of the desired outcome. Next, then, so that answers kind of the first question. Is there something different about the way that they use presuppositions? And in short, yes, there is. 2.0 therapists tend to use presuppositions more often. 2.0 therapists tend to presuppose the presence of something in addition to noticing differences. So then we get to this interactional description, and this didn't come necessarily from the microanalysis component, but more of the content analysis, where we went through each of the utterances and we said, in this utterance, in each utterance, does the client, or is the client speaking about something that contains a relationship? And oftentimes the therapist is going to ask about this, right? Who would notice? Who would be the first one to take note of that? What difference would it make to your partner? So oftentimes they bring in the perspectives of other people. Steve used to say, you could even bring in things like the dog or your shoe or your chair, right? So inanimate objects could also be a relationship. So what we did is we went through each of the presuppositions and we said, does the presupposition address something that's interactional? One of the things that I think is really important to note here is this last column. This is the number of relationships that were addressed across the entire session. In 1.0, they collectively addressed 18 different relationships, and in 2.0, they addressed 19 relationships. So the number of relationships addressed is not really very different. And again, I think that shows some continuity. There's something very similar about 1.0 and 2.0 as far as them talking about other people and other people's perspectives. You can see it ranges from 5 different relationships to 8 different relationships. And again, that doesn't matter if it's 1.0 or 2.0. But then you look here, total utterances with interactional statements, and you see a huge difference, right? From 86 1.0 utterances that contain relationships versus 203 2.0. Now, part of that is probably related to the number of utterances that are spoken in total. So I don't want to say that that means that they do this, 2.0 do this more. But if we look at the proportion, right, about 25% or 29% of the time do presuppositions include interactional statements, whereas 62% of the time for 2.0 do presuppositions include relationships. So what this means is that 2.0 therapists, they don't ask about more relationships, but they spend more time and more utterances and more presuppositions asking more details about those relationships. So they might not just ask one question of like, who would notice? But they might spend some time and say, what would they notice? What would be the first thing they would notice? What else would they notice? What difference would it make to them if they noticed this? How would you let them know that you were pleased that they had noticed, right? So oftentimes it's this building of detailed description around relationships. So one of the things that this kind of highlights is that 2.0 therapists do ask more interactional or relational questions. And this might be tied to, again, developing details about the presence of the desired outcome. And so again, it's not the number of relationships that are asked about, but it's how many utterances are used that include interactional statements. And then the third premise that we looked at is, are 1.0 or 2.0 therapists more action-oriented? And again, we would assume that because 1.0 therapists are kind of built on this goal orientation, that action orientation would come along with that. As you see here, it's only slightly more. It's 24% versus 8% of the time. One thing to note is that Elliot really kind of deviated from this. You can see that Chris and Evan very rarely use action-oriented words again like doing, what would it take, what would you need to accomplish next, those kinds of things. Elliot used 21 of these, but most often when he used these, the client had previously said, well, I would need to do blah, blah, blah. So the client would introduce the action-oriented word, and Elliot would then incorporate that into his next question. So again, 1.0 therapists, they use these about a quarter of the time within their presuppositions, whereas 2.0 therapists only use them about just under 10% of the time. So indeed, 2.0 therapists do use more action-oriented language, but again, I would probably say it's not a huge amount of difference within these. So that begs the question then, what are the conclusions of this? Again, I really want to emphasize, you want to be careful not to overgeneralize this information and say, well, 1.0 and 2.0 are completely different. They're not doing the same thing, because I don't think that's true. Again, this is one study that's looking at one piece of data, presuppositions. There are some things that are common about the way that they use presuppositions. They're using directing, redirecting, and continuous presuppositions about the same proportion of the time. But there are some differences. 2.0 therapists use more presuppositions, use them more regularly. 2.0 therapists are more likely to use conditional presuppositions. So when your desired outcome is present, what would you notice? And this oftentimes is, again, that link between a desired outcome and the questions that they ask. 2.0 therapists are less likely to use action-oriented language unless, again, introduced by the client. So the big takeaway here is that there is something different. There is an evolution that is happening. 1.0 therapists and 2.0 therapists are doing some things differently. And I think what this means is we as solution-focused brief therapists have choices to make. What do we think is important? What do we think will help bring about change? Do we want to do that in a goal-oriented 1.0 fashion, or do we want to do that in a description-oriented 2.0 fashion? So there's things to consider here. Now, obviously, this is brief. I couldn't capture everything. I would really recommend reading the article. It'll walk you through a lot of the analysis as well, so you'll see exactly how we did the analysis. But I think one of the big takeaways for each one of us is to consider, how do I, through my presuppositions, use language to help clients achieve change? And we have a couple of different ways that this can be done based on this study. So I hope that was helpful. Here is the official source for the paper. But also, if you want the paper, you can email me and I can send you a copy of the paper as well. I hope that was helpful. Please let me know what your thoughts are. I would love to hear about your take on presuppositions and how you feel like they might be useful or might not be useful. So let me know what you think. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on Evidence of Greatness.